Welcome to the Brett Johnson Biz podcast, where we discuss business on purpose, radically fresh leadership, capital that transforms society, and marketplace stories that embolden difference makers.
And I'd been through a number of C-suites in startups. I'd done 5 turnarounds, 4 of which were with global companies that were $10 billion or above.
Yeah.
And so I'm now being called and being told all the experience that you had was necessary preparation for, and now I realize that I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what finished looks like. So roughly in the 2009, 10, 11 timeframe, I was in a dialogue with the Lord, and he's learned that, kind of like the old Southern U.S. metaphor about a pig, you can lead the pig anywhere, but you can't drive him anywhere. The Lord has never given me directions. He's always asked me a question that internally compelled me to find a path and go a particular way to get an answer.
Yeah.
And the question on my mind from the Lord was, he said, I've called you to disciple nations. Do you believe in discipling nations? And I said, well, yes, Lord, of course I do. I've been the guy that stood up and raised my hand, went to the altar when people did the Matthew 28:19, go into all the world, make disciples of all nations. And he said, how many have you discipled? I said, well, I don't know. He said, could you point to one you think you've discipled? And I said, no, I really can't. But I'm working on this. And he said, well, what does finished look like? How are you going to know if you're done? Didn't Jesus say, I completed my work? And Paul said, I finished my course. I've run my race. Says, how are you going to know when you're done? And I said, I don't have a really good idea of what done looks like. So,
And at what stage of your life was this, John? Were you like in your 20s, in your 30s, in your 40s? When did you have this dialogue with God?
Good question. 29, 2010, I'm in my mid 50s.
Okay.
At the time. Okay.
Yeah. So you've been around the block a few times in doing all sorts of career things.
Sure. So I came to the Lord as an atheist in a sovereign encounter in 1972.
Yeah.
And after that, every decision was either the result of direction or an open invitation that I felt in my heart I should say yes to.
Yeah.
And I'd been through a number of C-suites in startups. I'd done 5 turnarounds, 4 of which were with global companies that were $10 billion or above.
Yeah.
And so I'm now being called and being told all the experience that you had was necessary preparation for, and now I realize that I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do it. I don't know what finished looks like.
Yeah.
And of course, whether you're a physicist in a laboratory and you're designing experiments, or whether you're doing a corporate turnaround or a startup, or even a church plant, we've done a number of church plants, you kind of have an idea what finished looks like. And all of a sudden, I'm in this conversation with the Lord, and it's embarrassing because I don't know what I'm doing. And instead of giving me answers, he keeps asking me questions. And so I finally said, well, Lord, how should I learn? What should I do?
Yeah.
And so a chap who was very important to me, a mentor at the time, said, well, John, your answer might be in the seven mountains. Have you ever heard of the seven mountains? I went, no. So he refers to a number of authors, and I start reading books. And along the way, this chap who had funded or had been the agent who gathered funding, about $7 million for a homeland defense startup that I was running,
Mm.
calls me up one day in October and says, John, what do you do in November, this to that? And I said, I don't know. He goes, wrong answer. He said, book yourself a hotel room in Redding, California. You're coming to Bethel with me. We're going to be in, and he named this big long title, an apostolic prophetic strategic planning. This is heaven meets Harvard Business School workshop. I said, why are we going to do that?
Yeah.
He says, because it's important for the next step of our walk with the Lord. This is a guy from salesman
Yeah.
from northern Alberta. I got advanced degrees and I mentored 5 university provosts. I've been to 7 universities,
Yeah.
handled hundreds of patents. I've done startups and turnarounds. I've co-hosted state dinners in foreign capitals. And
Yeah.
here's a guy from Cowtown, Alberta, saying this thing is, and he stumbled over the words. Now he's one of my dearest friends. So when he sees this, he's, yep, I did. I didn't know how to pronounce those words. So we show up at Bethel.
Before you say where you showed up, you remind me of you're like the Forrest Gump of the corporate world.
Oh, I was.
You've done so many different things, John.
Well, and I did think Apple was a fruit company when I first heard about it. And I ill-advisedly told my boss in the early 80s, we should buy Microsoft.
Yeah.
Not stock, we should buy the company.
Yeah.
And he's out, no, it'll never amount to anything. so, so, anyway, the one that got away. So yeah, so here we are. We're at Bethel, and the first thing I notice is there are 8 tables, one for each of 8 ventures or ministries. Everybody else has a team of people that are doing something already. They've done things together before, and they know what they're doing, and they need help pulling together a plan that would unify their actions and help them recruit others to join them.
Yeah.
Except us. There's 2 of us and a guy that was an executive coach from Mississauga, Ontario. We'd never done anything together before. And Charlie's got a place for us at a table. So when it's time to introduce ourselves, and everybody else has done this really coherent thing, I want to leave my table and join one of them. I say, Charlie, you got us here. You tell them what we're all about. And he basically stood up and said, well, it seemed like a good thing to do. We hope we can learn something. And he sat down. That was that. So we're kind of making it through, and the host of this is doing great things. And the 3rd day of our adventure, this guy named Brett Johnson comes through the door and does this kingdom impact assessment thing. And I thought to myself, I wonder if this guy knows what finished looks like. And he says, and I've got a book and I've done this. And, you talked about different things you had done already. And I've just written this new book called Transforming Society. And I got a copy, began to read it. And I noticed that you were very realistic, but also very snarky. The snarky might be 10 molehills instead of 7 mountains. you know, and if something's important, I think your statement was this: if there's something that is an important resource or an important value to a community, but it doesn't fit cleanly into the mountains, you should work on that, because a change there affects the community, affects society. And so that might be a mountain, might be a molehill, but you should pay attention to what the community finds important. And so we had a phone call after that, and I remember asking you, so let's transform something. What does finished look like? Has anybody written templates for, how to make business work and how to make media work and so on? And you said, well, John, maybe you should do that.
Yeah.
And I left the phone call scratching my head and thinking, he's just like Jesus. Every time I ask him a question, I get a new question that's a bigger assignment than I had when I started the conversation. So that's really how we met. I was on a quest, compelled by a question, and was seeking to know, if you're transforming anything, how do you know what finished looks like?
Yeah.
That's where we started.
Yeah. So that was nearly 15 years ago, 14 and a half years ago. Yeah.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah.
Well,
so you've been working with the Transforming Society frameworks, thinking, building on it, getting practical, doing all sorts of things since then, right?
Yes. And I've mentioned to you in the past, I got introduced along the way and became permanently joined to Commander Tim Taylor, who is the founder of what used to be known as Operation Rolling Thunder. And it's now called One Church, One Day.
Yeah.
Genesis was, he was a Navy officer who became the communication adjutant in Operation Desert Storm for the admiral, who was coordinating naval resources from 30 nations for their participation in that war. And while deployed, God revealed to him, when you're done with the Navy time, here's your assignment. And he put together a framework, took it to Peter Wagner, and Peter said, well, it's a nice theory, but go get some practical experience and see if it works.
Yeah.
And a few years later, he came back with a whole bunch of transformed communities.
Wow.
And then I met Tim. I took a look at what God had shown him, his method, his framework, and I said, okay, enough theory. I'm going to try this in my hometown.
Yeah.
And I succeeded at gaining the participation. That your goal in One Church, One Day is simple. Let's mobilize the churches in a community to divide a month into 31 days, where each fellowship will take a 24-hour period of time. That's their day.
Yeah.
And you can take multiples depending on your thirst and how many people you have. You form councils for the community that reach out to community leaders and identify the very things that show up in your situation assessment. You find out, what are our resources, what are our values, what are our problems, what are our needs. You do your SWOT analysis. And then these community councils set objectives. And the question is, in your area of responsibility, community leader, what would transformation look like?
Yeah.
How would you measure done? And how would you measure progress? Where are you today? And how do you measure progress? And then those things, whether it's the achievement of a new, valuable situation, or the removal of crime or homelessness or poverty or the reversal of an adverse policy in one state, they removed a euthanasia policy.
Yeah.
Okay? Whatever happens to be the thing, the church goes to work, and the theology is very simple: pray and obey.
Yeah.
So you pray, and if God whispers to you and says, you should do something about that, and they organize an effort and go do that. And there are now communities with 25 years of continued daily prayer that have their brag sheet of more than 400 breakthrough, factually verified results. Give you an example. So Gainesville, Florida, a friend of mine started a one church, one day movement there a number of years ago. It's not still going today. And along the way, they asked the police chief, what problems do you have? What goals do you have? What would transformation look like? And he'd been approached by people that wanted to pray for him before, very gracious, never turned it down. But he just threw over his shoulder this comment, says, well, pray about our cold cases. And for an audience that may not know, a cold case is a crime where all of the best efforts of the police have failed to find enough clues to let them identify the perpetrators and track them down to an arrest. And so literally they're not working the case, but it's still on the books as an unsolved crime.
Yeah.
So this says, okay, let's pray. Well, a few months later, a chap walks into the central police station, turns himself in.
Yeah.
Turns out that a few years before, he had been the serial killer on the University of Florida campus that killed 3 women.
Yeah.
But he had disappeared, gone to several other states and done the same thing there. And God got hold of him in the middle of the night and said, go back and confess everything and do it in Gainesville.
Yeah.
So anyway, I tried to set that up in our community. We did it 2 years in a row. And the notion was, if you can get them to pray for a defined period of time, not forever, say from National Day of Prayer in May to Global Day of Prayer in June, then there may be enough momentum there to catch on and take it. Well, we still have in our town a 24/7 prayer movement, but it's not well managed, not a lot of participation. We have days of prayer that we set aside for the whole community. So it's got some ongoing activity, but we never got the church to mobilize and continue every day, all year round. And when I look back and did the after action, we failed to really connect solidly with the leaders in the various mountains and molehills. And we approached it as something negative. We were taken with the Sentinel, George Otis transformation videos about communities and nations that were dying. Well, we're a peaceful, healthy, prosperous, well-educated retirement community.
So if you can overcome death, you guys are all good.
Yeah. And nobody was willing to put that on the tote board. I mean, you couldn't get the Undertaker to sign up for that goal. So anyway, you asked the question, you've been working this a while. I'm just telling you that I went from reading to sign me up, coach, send me in. I want to try my hand at a transformation effort and learn
Yeah.
from it.
Yeah.
Okay. And so that's kind of where it all began.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Good. That's amazing. Yeah. So you've talked about some things that are sustainable and some things that aren't. You've alluded to that with some of the Sentinel work and other things you've seen, and you're familiar with those studies. You've been involved in so many cities yourself. What do you think we could do differently? You talked about getting the churches mobilized, but I know you've got other layers to what you do. So what do you think we could do differently to make transformation more sustainable, since this is a long-term endeavor? It's not a transformation by proclamation, one and done type of situation.
Good question. And in some cases, well, this is a sandwich. There's a bottoms up and there's a top down. Okay.
Yeah.
If you put community change aside and you talk about change of any kind, you've dealt with some communities, Brett, and you've also dealt with change efforts that begin at the top, repurposing business for senior executives, repurposing finance for finance ministers, heads of state, etc. And you talked about the importance of policy. And as you know, policy is an expression of an enduring intent that says, we're setting this North Star here, not as the goal. We'll state goals, visions, etc. But these are the bounds. Here's the ditch on the left and the ditch on the right, and the policy is the center line around which we wish to travel that direction.
Yeah.
Right. So change efforts in individual lives, humans speak, is better than 99% away from pain, 1% toward pleasure. The reason we love our sports heroes is we don't realize that there's this selection cone of maybe 1 million golfers that result in one winning a PGA tournament. And we don't look at all the people who never won a regional tournament or a club championship, never made a Q school, never got a player's card. And out of the players, those that won a tournament, and out of the tournament winners, those that won a major, that's like a 1 in 1 million.
Yeah.
And the work ethic to get there is often punctuated with Vince Lombardi's famous quote. He says, practice does not make perfect. It makes permanent. Unless you're practicing perfectly, you will not become better.
Yeah.
So
he said practice makes permanent.
It does.
Gary Player, the golfer, said, the more I practice, the luckier I get.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, good.
I'm a fan of Gary Player too. Yeah. So anyway, so having said that, the question of sustainability always has to do with a goal whose reward, whose prize is worth the price that you pay.
Yeah.
And the price in community transformation is, what are the things you could be spending your time on that you're laying aside to do this?
Yeah.
Right?
That's true. Yeah.
So now the question is, what is an end state for life in a community that you're worth laying aside all other pursuits to achieve and some other pursuits to maintain?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I began looking at the answer to this question. Will we see an example of discipled nations in what the Old Testament prophets and the New Testament prophets would call the millennial kingdom?
Yeah.
And I decided by looking at it, yes, we will. And it's not mythical, it is immensely practical. And I frustrate my evangelical friends by citing some things that the prophets forgot to leave out when they wrote. So, and I'll just mention this, and then we'll come back to what I find, or what I have found and am finding compelling, and how I intend to use the lessons and the framework in transforming society. Because as you know, we've known each other a while. I've read thousands of books. I've met many of the authors. I've had dialogues with them to find out what wasn't written, what got left on the cutting room floor, if you will. If you're planning a second edition, is that because you've learned more, or you simply had things that your audience had to adopt first to believe you were credible enough to speak to the more controversial things second? There's always that motivation. So here's a couple of really big ideas. So Jesus has this parable, the talents parable, the meanest thing. And in one case, he basically just does a financial reward. Okay, take this one away from that guy and give it to the guy with 10. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, in the Matthew version of the parable, not the Luke version, he says this to the guy that's turned, 1 into 10. He said, "You've done very well with a little thing." And it wasn't a little amount, with a little thing. He said, "Take these 10 cities and govern them." And then he says something that frustrates all my evangelical friends. He says, "Enter into the joy of your Lord." What? Well, all my evangelical friends have some songs that they sing, and they dance up and down and shout and sing high and low and fast and slow. And until they're apoplectic and exhausted, they don't think they've experienced the joy of the Lord. And I've said, well, Jesus didn't do that. When he wanted joy, the joy set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame thereof. And when it talks about what he did with the joy, he sat at the right hand of God on high. And then he had Paul proclaim the kingdom is a progression. The foundation is righteousness. And David said, righteousness and justice are the foundation of your throne. And then peace. And then joy. And Micah and Isaiah wrote identical Hebrew verses, Isaiah to the Jews and Micah to the Gentiles. And they described a day when the mountain of the house of the Lord would be elevated above all the mountains and the hills. And it says the people will stream to it. By the way, that version, "and the hills," I thought Brett was right. There are mountains and there are hills.
Molehills, baby.
Right? All hills. So, and it says, so go and say, "Teach us your ways." And instead of conducting classes, he'll say, okay, here's a written framework of policies. It says the law will be published from Jerusalem, and then the application of it, the word of the Lord, will be published from Zion. Okay, well, then what happens? Well, then it says, He'll set up judgment, a judicial action to resolve disputes between people
Yeah.
and even rein in vicious nations at a distance.
Yeah.
And then it says they'll beat their swords into plowshares and pruning hooks into, or spears and pruning hooks, and they'll stop learning the ways of war. Okay,
Mm.
so there's the righteousness and justice.
Yeah.
And then it says, and then each man will sit with his neighbor under his own vine and under his own fig tree, and there will be no oppression, for none will make them afraid.
Yeah.
Okay, there's peace.
Yeah.
Okay, so you've got the progression.
Yeah.
You've got the kingdom, righteousness, peace.
Yeah.
The scripture says, when the righteous rule, the
Yeah.
people rejoice. When the wicked rule, the people groan.
Yeah.
So joy is always the predictable fruit of an enduring peace that's based on a foundation of righteous rule.
Yeah.
So when
Yeah.
Jesus wants joy, he rules righteously.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and it puts light on the Roman situation. The kingdom of God is righteousness, peace, and joy in the Holy Spirit. You know, there's those layers over there. John, do you think we're lazy? I mean, I try to overcome this laziness a bit in the Transforming Society book, but when I first encountered conversations about discipling nations, it was pretty much like a call at a missions conference, you know, get up and go.
Yeah.
But it was verbal fog. It was fuzzy. It wasn't broken down into something practical. And
Yeah.
part of it was we didn't sit and say, okay, let's look at the different sectors of societies, the spheres, even if you think there are 7 mountains, which, you know, I think it's more than that. But it doesn't matter. The point is, you know, and I don't mind, some people have 4, and everybody's got a good religious reason. You know, there's so many gates, there's so many this, there's so many tribes, there's so many whatever. For me, I've just got like, 5 fingers on each hand. It doesn't really matter. That the point is,
Right.
you've got to do the work by each sphere, thinking about what would it look like if the order, the beauty, the glory of God was restored to whether it's capital markets or media or healthcare. Do you think we've been lazy in doing the work to think that through?
Yeah, I not only think that, now I'm gonna be a conspiracy theorist. Okay.
Right.
I've followed church history from the writings in the first century all the way through.
Mm-hmm.
And even through the Reformation, things were pretty stable in terms of a small number of groups. And even the reformers were reluctant to call what they were doing a new denomination.
Yeah.
But we have better than 40,000 named
Yeah.
denominations today. The exponential explosion came because the British East India Company induced John Darby in 1871 to inject into the Protestant churches the notion of a pre-tribulation rapture.
Mm-hmm.
He further introduced the Pentecostals following Azusa Street to adopt a Protestant version of British Israelism, where you had another dividing line of people who believed that the presence of a geopolitical state that was now going to be Zion or Israel, and a congregation's support for that being fulfillment of divine prophecy.
Yeah.
Those two things, if you look, exploded the number of church sects, splits, and denominational formations that take place.
Wow.
Those were intentional desires by intelligence agents to distract the church, which was having a tremendous effect
Mm-hmm.
on the policies the morality and the national dialogue of the US and the UK
Yeah.
and through it Europe. So if you wanted to keep a praying church out of politics, you make them fight with each other.
Yeah.
Okay. So why am I saying that? You talked about, are we lazy? Well, yeah, and we're also distracted. They keep throwing the cat amongst the pigeons, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if you ask this question though, let's take Jesus out of the goal statement. Let's take the word discipleship
Yeah.
out for a minute, and you ask this question. What kind of neighborhood would you like to leave to your grandchildren?
Mm.
Well, if we set the goal, I'd like my neighborhood and my town to be the safest place in the world to live.
Yeah.
Well, who in the community would you have to get to first cooperate and collaborate, and what indicators of threat, what measures of success would you establish? And from where you are now, this is kind of the SWOT situation assessment. What framework for mobilization would you need to put in place? How would you measure achievement?
Mm-hmm.
How would you measure a threat? What public measures would you put in place that are posted and broadcasted like a tote board regularly?
Yeah.
What organizations would you sign up for and resource and train people and make responsible to observe, to monitor, and to intervene or to mobilize to keep that? Well, what if you also wanted this to be the happiest?
Yeah.
There's a global happiness index.
Yeah.
So there's people with a Thrive index, et cetera. So all I'm saying is you could march around the community, and if you had simple things like, we want to be the safest,
Yeah.
or we want our education system to produce practical scholars in every endeavor.
Mm.
Okay, well, what does that look like?
Yeah.
If we want the most vibrant set of youth sports, we want the healthiest
Yeah.
city and town for people of all ages. What does that look like? So
Right.
again, if you take this out of mountains and molehills terminology
Yeah.
and deal with things that an alien from Mars could be sent down from the mothership and report back
Yeah.
and simply answering, what do these people say about themselves?
Yeah.
Well, you'd like that report
Yeah.
for people with no theology and no cultural history.
Yeah.
Compare their outcomes to the 15 other cities the mothership sent spies down into, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Do you think we've done
Yeah.
not enough to impact policy and culture? You know, sometimes you set up a policy, you build a culture around the policy. When you've got that, okay, this direction, you know, you can just pick any item. Take, for example, I just came back from Rwanda last week. It's quite amazing for an African country that there's very little garbage in the street. I mean, so when I arrived, they said to me, well, you're not going to see any papers in the street. Now, there were exceptions, but not en masse exceptions. It was a piece of paper got away, not we have a culture of throwing things out of the car.
Yeah.
I mean, where I live in Tennessee, you'll find on the mountain roads, you know, clearly people just sometimes just throw their McDonald's stuff out of the window, whatever it might be. And here in South Africa, I was walking down the street the other day. It was a Sunday afternoon, and somebody had their car door open and they dropped some papers out. So I picked it up from underneath their car, showed them that I'd picked up their papers, and went and put it on the bin. But, you know, so there the Indians would see the situation in Rwanda. You don't throw papers out. You don't do that. And in another place you do. So something has happened. They have a similar thing in Nigeria. They call it Sanitation Saturday, but they don't actually do it. It's 2 hours on a Saturday where you have a curfew. They have that in Rwanda, but they do actually do it. The restaurant is not open. You can't go and get a cup of coffee because everybody cleans up. Apart from folks every mile or two just sweeping the streets. Yeah, so it's an interesting thing. Yeah, so something has happened. Something has been set in place that says we're not going to tolerate, and we're not, as a people, as an identity, we will not throw trash around. Yeah.
Did you happen to spend much time in New York City before and during the Giuliani years?
Yeah, I was there. I had an apartment in New York back in 1990, it was, where I was doing a project there for a financial services company back in that sort of era. I forget when Giuliani was there, but I know there was a huge shift. Yeah.
Yeah, it was in that. And I started out in business traveling New York City, in the early 80s and was scared to death.
Yeah.
I was scared of my taxi driver, but more scared that he might make me get out and walk 100 yards to my hotel door.
Yeah. Yeah.
But by the end of the Giuliani era, 1999, I remember leaving the Jacob Javits Convention Center down on the Hudson at 11:30 with a couple people, and we walked through the Garment District. We walked through Broadway. We walked through Times Square. We were staying at the Millennium, and we felt perfectly safe.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was in Mexico City that same year, and we were staying in the financial district, and literally there were two high-rise towers. One of them was a business set of towers, and we were negotiating a deal with one of the largest multinational firms headquartered in that building for international logistics. We were going to become the outbound logistics provider for the Volkswagen plant in Puebla. We were staying in hotel rooms in the tower next to it, and it was less than 100 feet from this front door to that front door. At 7:30 in the evening, we finished our meeting and they would not let us walk 120 feet.
Wow.
Because there was a history of people being accosted and their watches, their jewelry, their wallets being mugged in that 120 feet. Wow. Even though there were armed guards and police on the street. So they took us to the basement, put us in a caravan, lead car, travel car, trail car, up and out, drove 3 miles around, and they put us right out at the front door with guards to go to our hotel.
Wow.
And you contrast that to my experience walking in what had been more violent than Mexico City. But one man started with trash, then he went to graffiti, then he went to broken windows, then he went to abandoned cars.
Yeah.
And once he did those things, people paid attention to his policies.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You spent a lot of time, probably. I haven't. I've just read about it. Did you get to spend time with Lee Kuan Yew?
No, I didn't. No.
But you've traveled to Singapore.
Oh, yeah. Amazing. In fact, Kagame in Rwanda reads Lee Kuan Yew's book every year just to remind himself he's a big fan. And Yeah, and certainly there is criticism that he's been in office for 30 years, but people are quite happy with the outcomes. Most, the majority of people are happy with the outcomes for for a country that was in turmoil. And he is a big fan of the Singapore story. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. There was a TED Talk a few years ago by a small group of people in a particular city in India who found that I forget whether it was bus stations or subway or what it was, had become places for people to come and urinate and defecate in all around the place that people would come for public transit. And the government had tried all kinds of things and nothing worked. And so they basically, volunteers took a few gallons of paint and a new trash bin, and they came and cleaned everything up and they painted everything nice, bright colors. And that's all they did. No signs, no signals, but the people that had been urinating and defecating went somewhere else out of respect for something that citizens cared about.
Yeah.
So I'm saying that as the on-ramp to say our quest as leaders is to find something that people care about more than the status quo.
Yeah. Have you seen art and beauty drive transformation? Picking up on that?
In the micro.
Yeah.
I've not seen it in the macro.
Yeah.
Have you?
Well, it's interesting. Chattanooga's been written up as a bit of a story just because back in the early 1970s, I think it was Walter Cronkite that said it was the dirtiest city in the US. People had to wear masks, not because of COVID, but because of the pollution.
Wow.
And take a flashlight on their way to work just because it was that polluted. And the river was a real liability. It's interesting how they turned a liability into an asset. There's a whole story behind it, but one of the things that they did, apart from an aquarium and some other things and walkways next to the river and so forth, but they made the city attractive to artists. And part of their philosophy was not just the beautifying of the city, but the culture that comes with it, that deals with caring for a place and so forth. And so it has been written up as a case study, and certainly I think the element of beauty, which to me again is looking for glory. I think the evangelical Protestants have downplayed beauty as a way of inspiring people, connecting to God. We've lost the connection between place and the presence of God and people in many respects. And
I'm not only going to quote you, if you don't write a chapter or two on that in every book you publish from now on, I'm going to be very disappointed.
Well, I think it's, I was chatting with some church leaders in another African city, and I asked them, was literally just sitting around casually one Sunday evening, all from one church in a financial district. And I said, 5 years from now, the kingdom of God has come to your city. What does it look like? They thought for a bit and they said, our new church building is complete and it's full. That's it. And so then we began to brainstorm around, well, what about the garbage in the street? What about the drainage, the trees that have all been hacked down, let alone the unemployment and underemployment and the crime and other things like that. But once people get their juices going, they can come up with something. So I think part of our issue is we haven't put a picture in front of people, which is your question about, okay, what does the city feel like? What does it look like that you want your grandchildren? And then what are we going to do to get the steps to go there? I feel that discipling a nation, I was just reading this week when Jesus is saying, look, I think it was somebody who was a blind person or a lame person. Basically, he got them to use godly imagination. And because they said, yeah, I think you can do this for me. Jesus said, okay, go. Your faith has made you well. And we've got to use that godly imagination as to my town. Okay, so what would it look like if
Yeah.
if the glory of God was restored, if this operated in such a way that you would say, yeah, this would be a great place where humanity could live. And then
Yeah.
what are the baby steps we've got to do? And I like your point, John. Sometimes you're dealing with a problem, say it's crime. Other times it's aspirational. It's, oh, we have to have exercise equipment that works, or walking trails, or we have to have access to clean water, internet, whatever it might be. And so
Right.
sometimes it's a new thing, and sometimes it's dealing with an old thing. Yeah, there is an interesting thing you made me think about on your crime story in Florida, in Gainesville, Florida. Believe it or not, the South African police uh, organization has a crime spiritual task force. It's a, yeah. So what they do is and there's an expression of this in the local community where we live. So what it is their job is to engage local spiritual leaders to help them solve problems. And so, so they get people from different churches. It's volunteers, a Baptist, a Presbyterian, whatever. They get a mix, and then they pray about the problems, and they pray for the police force and with the police force. And it's I think it's called the Crime Spiritual Task Force, words to that effect.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah. We'll put that in the resource book. Hey, read
Yeah.
this. Yeah. Um,
Yeah.
so let me turn a little bit to something that you'll look at and you'll say, that's discipleship, but they don't call it that.
Yeah.
So I met with the superintendent of schools, chief administrative or chief academic officer, and their techie at the superintendent's request a month ago.
Yeah.
And I had uh, I had teased her privately at the end of a public presentation she did that was brilliant.
Yeah.
And I asked her some questions that showed that the very thing she was advocating, which was the incorporation of artificial intelligence as a means of accelerating curiosity and learning, could be her very undoing, and her legacy could be lunacy if she wasn't careful.
Yeah.
And she said, well, what's your concern? I said, well, let me just say this. I have either led inside major successful companies
Yeah.
AI initiatives twice, and I have run two companies whose product and service was successful, and it was based on AI.
Yeah.
So I'm not naive. I said,
Yeah.
so let me ask you a question. From a credibility standpoint, if you have some facts over here that occur only in a few documents, but those documents are peer-reviewed scientific and scholarly journals,
Yeah.
and you have countervailing or contravening or contradictory facts over here that are on the internet 400,000 times in social media, and you ask a large language model a question, which answer is it going to give you?
Yeah.
She said, I don't know. I said, you probably should know
Yeah.
that answer before you tell students
Yeah.
use this model
Yeah.
for your learning.
Yeah.
Are there ways to use prompt engineering to bias your answer? She goes, I don't know. I said, you should.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I said, so here's the other thing. you as a PhD in education or an EDD, I forget her degree, you obviously believe in scholarly journals and peer-reviewed publications, right? She said, absolutely, it's the gold standard. I said, so how many articles have been retracted in the last 5 years from scholarly journals?
Yeah.
How many scholarly journals have been terminated and suspended from publication by publishers because the editorial staff could not assure the readers that they were following accepted standards for peer review before publishing articles?
Yeah.
Says, I don't know. I said, well, the numbers are, 19 journals last year, 40,000 articles to date in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Which of your large language models that has noted a published paper and is ready to reference those facts will remove said article when there's a retraction notice?
Yeah.
She said, I don't know. I said, wouldn't it be nice if your chief academic officer and your techie that's helping people configure and learn knew the answer to those questions? They said, yes. And I said, so here's my question to you. What things did your predecessor do that you no longer do that had a history of zero cost to the budget, zero increment to the staff, acceleration of academic excellence and outcomes? She said, I don't know. And I said, I do, because both of my sons graduated from your schools, and one went on to become the very first high school intern at Microsoft in history.
Yeah.
The other took his associate's degree. That we have a Running Start program where you can spend your last 2 years high school and community college and graduate at the same time. Said he never went to class another day, and at the age of 34 became the chief technology officer of a nationally regarded chain of banks.
Yeah.
He learned the collaboration skills that he used for that in Boy Scouts.
Yeah.
The other learned them in Montessori schools. What do they have in common? She goes, I don't know. I said, there's zero bullying in either organization because every student has a peer mentor that's 2 years older.
Yeah.
Well, that's discipleship. So she kind of said, oh, oh, oh. Well, what they do with it remains to be seen. I maintain the dialogue. I'm only saying that to say part of our laziness you asked about earlier is we won't listen to people that don't use terminology that clearly is referenced by scripture.
Yeah.
But if they do, we will dismiss them out of hand because it isn't our version of scripture, or we think it's a secular, not a sacred pursuit, and we don't want that. So we're back to your question about, or your statement about Rwanda and public cleanliness. If that became a policy, and if somehow the entire community was persuaded somehow to participate and make it a matter of my values and our values and community pride, if you want to call it that. It's the ethos.
Yeah.
Your book deals with foundations.
Yeah.
Does that become a foundation for another us thing
Yeah.
where each of us have a sphere of responsibility, and maybe it's our block, our house, our street.
Hmm. Yeah, I think there is a foundational element tied to people's identity in part. If you don't own something or you feel it's not yours, you're less likely to take care of it. That's not totally a solution, but there's also something about the value of work, uh, God's view on beauty, uh, and human dignity. I think these, as I go to different countries, and you see this, or even within the US, different cities have differing degrees of things. I don't think you can put it down to education. I don't think you can put it down to cultural background necessarily. I think that there are what we lose as an opportunity in transformation is changing habits. We'll go in with big thoughts, lofty thoughts, here's a goal, and so on. But I liked your point about what Giuliani did. And I saw the same thing in Lagos,
Oh,
where you go after almost micro habits, small things. And so in Lagos, Governor Fashola at the time, he picked the most lawless, well, apparently lawless. I'm not talking about mass criminals. And it was the Okada drivers, which is the motorbike taxi guys.
sure.
And so first thing he did was they had to get registered. Otherwise, they came off the street, right? Next thing is they had to wear a helmet. So next thing was their passenger had to wear a helmet, right? And so you would see a Nigerian lady sitting side saddle with a cheap plastic construction helmet 6 inches above her head, going down the street like I'm doing nothing. But it
Yeah,
was a start. And what made me think of it was, and then it was one-way police, because they had one-way streets, and some guy with a big black Mercedes or SUV would have his chap go out, walk in front of him, and clear the cars out of the way because he was going the wrong way down a one-way, and it was his quickest way to get somewhere in rush hour traffic, right? So then Governor Fashola put in one-way police and so forth. And so bit by bit by bit, and I thought this guy understands more about discipling a city than the pastors do. And yeah, and when we got to Rwanda, what I noticed as well is the motorbike taxis, they all have helmets sponsored by Airtel Networks, it seems, and they all had little jackets on sponsored by MTN, or who gave it to them for free, but you could identify them. And
right.
and there was a code of conduct among what could be the most unruly element in a city, these guys driving everywhere. And it's seeped into the culture. And one of the reasons why I think it's seeped into the culture is because they had a very difficult time 30 years ago with the genocide.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
they focus on, there's an urgency about
yes,
getting stuff right because we've seen the consequences of getting stuff wrong.
yeah,
Whereas in
right.
many developed cities, you take it for granted that you're living off the legacy of what happened 100, 200, 300 years ago,
Yeah,
and you
yeah,
become casual with it, and you
yeah,
don't steward the societal assets and the culture and
yeah.
the disciplines. Yeah,
So remember the introductory script always to the Mission Impossible show.
yeah,
Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is. So if your job were to disciple ESCOM,
yeah, what would
clearly,
I do?
clearly the big hammer, the brute force, the regulatory enforcement, the financial incentives, all of that have found ESCOM's culture to be the immovable object. So
Yeah,
what's the one pebble at a time with ESCOM?
yeah. I think I would try to find the equivalent of the lowest level cultural things that lets people get away with not doing a good job.
Mhm.
Sometimes it's a perception of work. So it might be accountability for your electrical toolbox, what's in it and what you haven't done it. So a friend of mine lives in a small town in South Africa. The chap he knows was the supervisor of the guys doing all of the electrical maintenance.
Right, right.
And this guy knew where everything was. Everybody had their toolbox. They had to account for everything all of the time.
Yeah,
Then they replaced him with another guy for BEE purposes over here, they call it, for quota purposes. And they moved him to another town. Within 6 months, all the tools were gone and the job couldn't get done. So for me, that's a low level thing, somebody's toolbox. I would try to find the equivalent thing.
yeah.
And yeah, you can say, okay, we're going to have I'll give you another example. In South Africa, a government of national unity. I don't know how much unity there is, but the ANC lost their absolute majority. Somebody took over the Home Affairs Department, which had a multi-year backlog on visas, passports, those type of identity documents.
Yeah.
And there was a new guy in town, and by Christmas, they cleared the backlog. There's some cases still under review where a visa was denied or a passport was denied, and those are going through a review cycle. Every other current pending thing gone, and they did it in about 100 days or something, and
Yeah.
yeah, so I think a little bit of the back to work policies. I think companies, governments, we know the government is struggling with that, but companies as well, because
Yeah.
you've seen large corporate headquarters built up in the Seattle area, and then COVID hit and they were never occupied there to sell them and so on. Other
That's
people, this is it just the use of real estate, or is it reinstilling some corporate disciplines? How much of that is valid, not valid? When is it okay to be a remote worker? When is it better to actually come in? And so forth. So behind that, there's an element of work. There's also an element of, can you fulfill your purpose? What allows you to fulfill your purpose? And
well, there you go.
so, yeah, I think sometimes we look for the big things, and it's the small things that can make a difference.
Exactly. And a quote that also is in my toolkit was an early mentor for me in business was Peter Drucker. Only met him once, but had read his lifetime published body of work before then.
Mm.
And this one quote, I'll never forget. He said, there is no more tragic waste of resources than to do a thing with maximum efficiency that should not be done at all.
Wow.
Um, I pulled that into work back in the mid 90s to 2010. Electronic procurement was a big thing in the US, and there were
Yeah.
companies that went to the buy side and said, install this Ariba One, this Commerce One, this Ariba, this Elecom thing. And you look at all the efficiency you'll save by not handling purchase requests, purchase orders, invoices, material, blah, 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 blah. And all the numbers were absolutely true. The problem they ran into is that 5% of their suppliers were sophisticated enough to reframe their catalogs in CXML terms and place them into the ordering system of their buyer.
Yeah.
90% of the suppliers were small, didn't do enough business to make it profitable to hire the staff, and staff was scarce to do that, blah, blah, blah. Well, so our company, startup, decided we were going to pursue some kind of e-procurement supplier buyer mediation thing where that collaboration would result in the production of a catalog that could be easily maintained by the supplier and imported in the right form to the buyer, and then electronic purchase and shipping documents would be exchanged over the internet. It's a great idea. Well, the first blush was based on the great revenues we'll have. Boeing, we've done business with before. Boeing has 30,000 suppliers. Okay, well, man, we're going to make a ton of money doing this. The company fired me 1 month into their efforts and then spent $40 million, got nothing for it. They were about to close on one big client in Wall Street when 9/11 hit and their offices went down in the South Tower.
Wow.
And an investor didn't want to let the idea die. So she and I hired some people from the ruins of this failed company. 90 days later, $125,000 spent.
Yeah.
We produced the application and got a revenue generating client that we didn't use any of the code or any of the patented ideas. We started from scratch. We did with 125,000 in 90 days what they hadn't been able to do with $40 million and 2 years of effort.
Yeah.
And when you look back at what we did that they didn't, they were trying to solve this problem.
Yeah.
We solved the one problem that the buyers and suppliers wanted right now. And then we began to incrementally build on that. But we built that not out of investment equity, but out of operating cash flow.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
So back to transforming society, if you pick the one problem that a society has right now,
Yep.
and knowing that you've got a big picture, knowing that you've got a there, that you've got a framework and you've got an aspiration that you're heading to, but is it your view that cities would be more open if we went in to solve their felt need problem and in the context of something bigger?
You said it perfectly. Yeah.
Yeah.
Back in the day before video games, do you remember when you put a quarter in the machine and play pinball?
Yeah.
What was the goal for the first quarter you put in the machine?
I would say to get another game without having to spend yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so you wanted to get enough free games on the board that now you could bump the machine and take the risk of tilting it, because you could get 2, 3, 4, 5 things if only you could get the ball to do this route.
Yeah.
And you could only get there by jostling the machine, but not enough to tilt it.
Yeah.
And I think pinball is the right metaphor for community transformation.
Yeah.
Right.
Awesome. Well, John, we're probably going to have to wrap up the conversation over there. And it's been a pleasure to see your thinking around this over more than a decade, and look forward to future conversations on this. Let me ask you this. As you've read Transforming Society, and my mind actually did go to some things between the first edition in 2010 and the second edition in 2016. What are the things that you added? I did think about that. But if you were to tell me to do a third edition and put a bit more emphasis onto this or that, what would you tell me you'd like to see more of or less of?
Well, I think you got the right framework and you got some compelling case studies. I'd find more of the pragmatic case studies, which we just talked about, of can you find one niggling problem that somebody is willing to solve. And in some cases, Brett, if you go back to therapy, psychology. 99% of successful therapists know that the first problem someone tells you about is a phantom. It's not their problem. They don't care if you solve it or not.
Yeah.
Unless you solve something that doesn't matter,
Yeah.
they will not tell you the truth about why they're really there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Every community has, and by the way, every turnaround I've ever done, the team that comes through the door, they always give you a bunch of insignificant crap to work on
Yeah.
just to see how you handle success, failure, and team dynamics before they open up the kimono and say, well,
Yeah.
so your notion of Lagos, your
Yeah.
notion of Rwanda, Lee Kuan Yew,
Yeah.
uh, grand vision, but he started with chewing gum and trash on the streets.
Right.
And then he talked about public education, and then he talked about warehousing. And
Yeah.
eventually, his goal that was out of everybody's reach was for all oceanic cargo travel between these oceans. We want to be the place that a ship's captain sends her multi-port itinerary, knowing that we will arrange everything from intermediate storage to the seafarers to the longshoremen to the insurance to the papers to everything they need. That you'd spend 6 months doing that in advance of a 10-day trip. We'll do all of that for you. But they couldn't start with that. They had to earn their way by the way they treated the freighter when it tied up in port. And they built an incremental series of services that were done with such reliability that when they said, why don't you give us a try? The thing that will make you our captive customer forever, you'll never go anywhere else.
Yeah.
After you've done this, they had to pick up the trash and paint the fence and
Yeah. Great.
but there,
It's a good reminder.
So yeah, I'd find some people that have done little things. They don't have to have done the big thing.
Yeah.
So anyway,
Well, I've got some stories in that regards, so we'll have to pick up. I think we'll have to have another conversation, and maybe we'll delve into some of those stories.
Well, let me close with one tiny story. In 1998, 99, I was in a new job as a CIO for this logistics company, and we were doing the right things. We had cleared the calendar for Y2K. Everything was great. Then I became the chief quality officer. Detroit had said to all their logistics providers, unless you achieve ISO 9000 certification, you can no longer bid on our business.
Yeah.
The average in the industry was $2.2 million in 27 months with no hard dollar savings to justify it. It was a check the box.
Yeah. Expense.
I took a different approach. We spent $40,000 and we achieved the fastest ISO 9002 audited certification in history, and it's still a record to this day. But I did that based on tales that I learned from Florida Power and Light dealing with storm-related power outages.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that another time.
Great.
So tell stories that people can put in their toolkit.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Great. Good.
Okay, thanks.
John, thanks for the conversation. Greatly appreciated. Appreciate your time. And It's been fascinating chatting with you. There's so many topics we could talk about, given your wide background, your breadth of experience. I don't know if anybody's called you the Forrest Gump of the corporate world before, but certainly you've done a lot of things.
Well, when people say, "What's your relationship with Brett?" I'm going to say, "Well, me and Brett are like peas and carrots."
Fantastic. Good. Okay. John, thanks
Okay.
so much.
All
Cheers.
right.
Thank you. Right. Bye-bye.
Take care, brother. Bye bye.